The gates of the Whitfield estate had never opened for a man like him before until the morning. Ejiro Okonkwo walked through them not as a stranger, but as the one person who could save the family that once looked down on him. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, leaving the driveway of the Whitfield mansion glistening under the late morning sun. Ejiro adjusted his cap, smoothed the front of his gray uniform, and gripped the steering wheel of the black sedan with hands that had once trembled from hunger, not nerves. 3 years ago, he had been sleeping under a bridge in Lagos, surviving on leftover bread from a bakery whose owner took pity on him. Now he drove for one of the wealthiest families in the city, and yet the woman he loved sat 2 feet behind him, separated not by distance but by a world that refused to let them touch. Edith Whitfield stared out the tinted window, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with the strap of her handbag. She was the only daughter of Chief Obiora Whitfield, a shipping magnate whose name opened doors across 3 continents. She had grown up surrounded by marble floors and silent servants. Yet the only person who ever made her feel truly seen was the quiet driver her father had hired after finding him collapsed, outside the company gates, feverish and starving, clutching nothing but a torn photograph of a woman who was no longer alive. If you believe in second chances, in love that survives class and circumstance, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Whispering Tales Stories, because today's story about Ejiro and Edith will remind you that the heart does not recognize the boundaries society draws. For months, Ejiro had said nothing of his feelings. He drove Edith to her university lectures, waited outside boutiques for hours without complaint, and listened whenever she needed to vent about the suffocating expectations of her father's world. Slowly, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, the silence in the car became comfortable, then warm, then charged with something neither dared to name. It was Edith who broke first. One afternoon, caught in Lagos traffic with the sun bleeding gold through the windshield, she asked him why he never spoke about his past. Ejiro's jaw tightened, but something in her voice, gentle, without pity, loosened the knot he had carried for years. He told her about his mother, a seamstress who died from an illness they couldn't afford to treat, about the university dreams he abandoned to work labor jobs, about the humiliation of begging strangers for bus fare. He expected her to recoil, to remember suddenly that he was just her father's employee. Instead, she reached forward and placed her hand gently on his shoulder, and for the first time in years, Ejiro felt like a man rather than a shadow. Their closeness did not go unnoticed. Chief Whitfield's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Ngozi Adeyemi, watched them with growing suspicion. She reported to the chief that his daughter had been spending unusual amounts of time laughing in the car, lingering by the garage, requesting the same driver for every outing. Obiora Whitfield, a man who built his empire on control, could not tolerate the idea of his daughter falling for a man who owned nothing. He summoned Ejiro to his study one bright afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating shelves of trophies and framed photographs of business deals shaking hands with presidents. Chief Whitfield did not offer him a seat. "You will resign by tomorrow morning," he said, his voice flat, final. "I built this family's name on discipline and status. I will not have my daughter's future tied to a man who cannot even afford his own roof." Ejiro wanted to argue, to say that his worth was not measured by a bank balance, but he had learned long ago that pride meant nothing to men who had never known hunger. He simply nodded, thanked the chief for the opportunity, and walked out with his head low but his back straight. When Edith learned what her father had done, something inside her cracked. She confronted him in the same study, her voice trembling with a fury she had never shown before. She reminded her father that he too had once been poor, that her grandfather had sold firewood on the streets of Onitsha before building the very empire her father now used as a weapon against love. Chief Whitfield's face hardened, but for the first time doubt flickered behind his eyes. Meanwhile, Ejiro returned to the modest room he rented in Ajagunle, the weight of loss heavier than any hunger he had known. He had lost his job, yes, but worse. He feared he had lost the only person who ever made him feel like more than his circumstances. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the torn photograph of his mother, and whispered an apology for failing to build the life he promised her he would. 3 days passed in silence. Then on a bright Sunday morning, a knock came at his door. Ejiro opened it to find Edith standing there, dressed simply, without a single trace of the designer labels she usually wore. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. "I don't care what he says," she told him. "I don't care about the house, the money, or the name. I only care about the man who taught me that kindness matters more than status." Ejiro's throat tightened, unable to speak. Before he could respond, a car pulled up outside, Chief Whitfield's own vehicle. The old man stepped out, his expression unreadable, a folder tucked under his arm. Ejiro braced himself for another confrontation, but instead, Whitfield extended the folder toward him. Inside were university enrollment documents, fully paid, along with a formal offer to manage one of the company's smaller logistics branches on a trial basis. "My daughter reminded me of something I forgot," Whitfield said quietly. "I did not build this empire from privilege. I built it from struggle, just like you. I was wrong to judge a man's worth by the uniform he wears." Ejiro looked at Adaeze, tears blurring his vision, then back at the folder in his trembling hands. It wasn't charity. It was recognition, the kind he had never received in his life. For the first time since his mother's passing, he felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. 6 months later, Ejiro stood in a modest lecture hall, notebook in hand, pursuing the business degree he once thought was lost forever. Adi sat beside him during breaks, no longer the sheltered heiress, but a woman unafraid to stand beside the man she loved, regardless of what the world whispered. Chief Whitfield, though still stern in business, had grown to respect the young man who refused to let poverty define his character, and slowly, cautiously, allowed him into the family not as a driver, but as someone worthy of his daughter's hand. If this story touched your heart even a little, please give it a like, drop a comment below, and share it with someone who needs to believe that love and dignity can rise above any circumstance. Your support means everything to this channel. On the day of Ejiro and Adaeze's traditional engagement ceremony, held under the bright afternoon sun in the Whitfield family compound, Ejiro stood in agbada instead of a driver's uniform, his hands no longer trembling from hunger or fear, but from joy. Adaeze walked toward him in a shimmering ivory gel, her father standing proudly beside her, no longer a barrier between them, but a bridge. As the crowd cheered and the drums echoed across the compound, Ejiro looked toward the sky and silently thanked his mother, certain that somewhere she was smiling down on the life he had built, not through money, but through patience, humility, and unwavering love. Before we end today's story, drop the word grace in the comments if you believe true love can overcome any obstacle life throws in its path. And as the sun began to set behind the Whitfield estate, casting warm golden light over two families now bound not by wealth, but by love, Ejiro and Adaeze understood that the greatest inheritance was never money or status. It was the courage to choose each other, no matter the cost.